England, like France, experienced the revolutionary turmoil politically, not simply economically. It was part of the transition to modernity. With that question of modernity, though, comes a bigger idea of progress, that countries are becoming better than they were before. Now, that idea of better is a value judgment based upon we like what we have, we don't like what they have, we think it's better. Right? There are also questions of better that have to do with stability. Governments should provide stability. England, by 1800, experienced a tremendous amount of political stability compared to what was happening on the continent. That would then lead to the question, okay, so is England the most advanced country in 1800? But that begs the question, what does advancement mean? Generally speaking, there is a modern prejudice for constitutional government, that constitutional governments provide better stability than whimsical governments. In a constitutional system, a country has a fundamental set of laws and principles that define the organization and powers of the government. There are written laws that organize the government, describe its component parts, and describe the parts, the powers that each of those parts play. Written laws provide a benchmark for government behavior. Written laws place limitations on government's behaviors. So there's a lot of evidence that limited governments limited by written law, do provide greater stability than unlimited government. Governments in which individuals and groups of individuals act upon their own whims and desires. England certainly had made advances towards constitutional government by 1800. It had experienced a bloody civil war during the 17th century. It then went through what it called the Glorious Revolution that settled many constitutional questions, so that by the 1800s, England did not have the political turmoil of other monarchical dynastic governments. One of the key explanations for that stability then is because it had a constitution. Now, it didn't have a constitution like the American Constitution that was written all in one place. It was a set of principles and a set of laws that were generally agreed upon that guided political behavior. So what was that, quote, constitution? By 1800, when someone said English Constitution, they meant a mixed government. They referred to the Aristotelian principles of government. Aristotle, ancient Greek philosopher, had written about the different types of policies in his world. And so he described three basic types. In one, right, community, a single person ruled for all. In another type of community, a few people ruled for all. In a third type, many ruled for all. Rule by the one, rule by the few, rule by the many. Those words then get passed down to us as a monarchy is ruled by the one, an aristocracy is ruled by the few, and a democracy is ruled by the many. These are the Aristotelian forms. The English prided themselves because they had a mixed government. It wasn't one of these in particular, but it found a way to balance them. Obviously, the monarchy is the monarchy, but the House of Lords was an aristocracy, and the House of Commons was a many. So the English Constitution allowed the one, the few, and the many to participate in the formation and making of laws, to participate in government. They argued that this created balanced interest, that no one interest in society could then overwhelm the other. They all provided a system of checks and balances. And if any one, right, if the monarchy got out of control, the aristocracy and the democracy would come together. If the aristocracy and the monarchy got out of control, the democracy could come together. This was the theory. Right? It wasn't as well defined as the American Constitution. The authors of the American Constitution learned from the ambiguity of England and wrote more specific requirements, but it did provide a benchmark for judging behavior. It provided a standard by which politicians were held to account. The basic interest it tried to balance was the wider public interest with what it considered private interest. Right? In modern language, this usually gets translated in something like the personal interest or the private interest versus the community or social interest. Obviously, these two can go hand in hand, but there are instances in which a single individual might have to give way to the public. Right? There's a greater good that a single individual will have to suffer. This is one of the classic problems of eminent domain. The public needs a road. The individual owns the property. They don't want to sell the property. The public takes the property for the public good, the common good. But if it did that all the time, if the public consistently trampled on the private interest, that would lead to social disruption and social turmoil. In a monarchy, it's easy to see how this would happen. The monarch thinks he is the public interest, and so he will constantly trample on the private interest. The opposite is true also. It can happen in a democracy, that the many can trample on the interest of the few. It happens in religion, can happen in schools, where the many believe that their desires, because they're in the majority, should outweigh the interest of any minority. So what the English argued was that their system would provide a system of checks and balances and prevent any one social interest from trampling on the needs of an individual or a private group. The problem with what this was is that this was a makeshift, organically grown system. There was no real logic to it. And so by the 1830s, critics called it the unreformed system. Now, this unreformed system we're talking about refers to members of parliament, and specifically members who sat in the House of Commons. So that the question of reform didn't deal much with the monarchy, didn't deal much with the House of Lords, but it targeted very specifically the philosophical basis of the House of Commons. Did the members of parliament represent the many or the few? Right? Because theoretically, under this mixed form of government, the democracy should represent the will of the many. But the reality was that members of parliament represented special interest. So, for example, there were, out of the 600 members of parliament, 600 members of the House of Commons, close to 300 were from rotten or pocket boroughs. The image we have on the screen is of Old Sarum. If you look at it right now, you'll see that no one lived in Old Sarum, or no one lives now in Old Sarum. In 1830, no one lived there either. This was simply a piece of property, right? Land. But if you go back into the Middle Ages, it's not hard to imagine that the ring around it was a wall. You see the outlines of a church. In the middle was a keep. And so what today in the 1830s was a field of, at the time, was a thriving medieval community. Well, during the Middle Ages, Old Sarum gained two representatives, two members of parliament. And through the 1500s and through the 1600s, through the 1700s, 1800s, as the population of Old Sarum vanished, and you can see that there's a community not far away today, right? People left and went moved someplace else. As it died, no one bothered to say, hey, does Old Sarum need a member of parliament? And so the owner of Old Sarum returned two members of parliament from Old Sarum. Right? In other words, the owner of this land had the member of parliament in their pocket. It was their tool, like you'd have a pen or you'd have a wallet or anything, or some keys. The owner of Old Sarum would send them. This was another term for this was rotten borough, because the intent of a member of parliament is to represent the many, but in this case, they represent a few. It was very common practice during the early 19th century to rent members of parliament, so that very wealthy people could go to, for example, the owner of Old Sarum and say, I'd like to give you £3,000 and use your member of parliament for the next session. Now, we talked about monetary value before. When £5 is subsistence, to be able to rent a member of parliament for £3,000 is a considerable amount of money, but it's also a considerable amount of income. So the people who owned these rotten boroughs, the people who owned these pocket boroughs, right, who sent to, they saw this as an incredibly valuable piece of property, right? It was their property, just in the same way as the property of the kingdom belonged to the crown, or the property of a dukedom belonged to the duke. These commoners came to understand that these members of parliament belonged to them. So this division between private interest and public interest had become incredibly blurred in the unreformed system. We can see that a little bit closer when we look at the breakdown in the unreformed House of Commons. Once again, we're not talking about the monarchy. We're not talking about the House of Lords. The monarchy should represent the interest of the monarch. The House of Lords should represent the interest of the lords, but commons should represent commoners. Well, 24% of them had direct aristocratic connections. They were the sons of peers. Right? In England, a peer sat in the House of Commons. That was a hereditary title, and it went to the oldest son after the father died. Well, what happens if the father's not dead? There were sons of peers who sat in the House of Commons. Did they represent their own interest, or the interest of their father? Or maybe a younger brother? 25% came from the gentry, the large landowners. They did not have a title, but they owned their land outright and hired people to work it. 33% came from the professional ranks. Someone in law, an attorney, prosecutor, an advocate, an army officer, a naval officer. If someone is serving in His Majesty's Royal Navy, was that person independent and representing the interests of a constituency, or did that person represent the interest of the monarchy? 15 to 20% represented either commercial, financial, or manufacturing interests, right? That's a wide range of interest there. Commercial, maybe long distance trade, coastal trade, continental trade, financial, banking interest, manufacturing. By this time, right, the Industrial Revolution's going. So there are wealthy industrialists who see fit to either buy their own way into the House of Commons or rent a member of Parliament. But if you look at this and you ask the question about representation, do these individuals represent the one, the few, or the many? And the only clear picture or clear answer to that is that they really don't represent the many. These are not representatives of anybody who is going to work in a field, right? A peasant. They're not representative as anybody going to work in a blacksmith shop or a cobbler shop or a bakery or a miller, right? These people represent the highest ranks of society. And just like in France, there was a growing awareness, a growing demand for wider political participation. And so in the 1830s, that demand reached a crescendo and produced a reform bill. It happened in an atmosphere of a threat of violence. There were violent outbursts in early 19th century England and Britain as a whole. Most textbooks don't talk about that because it gets brushed over, because it doesn't boil over into a full, revolution. Kings don't lose their heads, noblemen don't lose their heads. But there were outbursts of local violence. For example, in Nottingham, the people of Nottingham got so aggravated that the Lord of Nottingham was opposing the reform bill, that they went up and burned his estate. So England was able to avoid a lot of the widespread violence on the continent because political leaders had a history of reform. They didn't want reform, they didn't advocate for reform, but there was a greater awareness that reforms kill revolutions. And so English political leaders walked a tightrope on how much reform to embrace and how much to oppose. They were able to rework their constitution. This was a period of constitutional reform. Didn't touch the monarchy, didn't touch the House of Lords, but it did reform the House of Commons. So what we're going to look at are three things. We're going to look first at the early 19th century political tendencies. How did people approach politics? How did they see politics? We're going to look at the constitutional reforms themselves in 1832. And then how did changes to the House of Commons impact reform or impact other policies? How did reform impact the rest of government? Because you can't just change the mix of who's voting and who's participating and not change the outcome. The fights over voting and suffrage are fights about power, because people with power understand that power leads to wealth. And that if they allow poor people access to political power, they are also allowing them avenues to wealth, right? The king was not shy about using his power to gain wealth. Happened throughout history. Lords were not shy about using their power to get wealth. Democratic institutions are not shy about trying to make sure that the people as a whole, right, the public gets wealth. But the English did not want any one interest to dominate and then kill off the others. The Great Reform Bill of 1832 tried to find a balance, right? Tried to keep that constitutional balance of powers in play, because they did believe they had the most advanced and most stable government, and they didn't want to follow the path that France followed in 1789. That was bad.